Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality characteristics in the Bernie Madoff case. Bernie Madoff was an investment advisor and market maker who operated the largest Ponzi scheme in history. The fraud involved about $65 billion over the course of his career. So everyone I'll be talking about in this video, of course, are real people. So just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody here, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. Now, some people have asked about the irony of somebody with the last name Madoff who made off with billions of dollars. And this also made me wonder about the association between names and criminality in general. And I'll talk about this at the end of the video. So first I'll look at the timeline of the criminal activity, Bernie Madoff's background, and then the mental health and personality factors at work in a case like this. So the timeline we see begins in 1960. Bernie Madoff started a penny stock firm, and he ran it as a sole proprietor until 2001, at which time he formed a limited liability company. At some point early in his career, Madoff started running a Ponzi scheme. It's not really clear when he started. Some theories say 1964. Others say sometime in the 1980s. Madoff said it was in 1991. So a Ponzi scheme is also called a Peter to Paul scheme because somebody robs Peter to pay Paul. They take money from an investor, put it in a bank account, and then pay that investor profits from that account. So they pay them with their own money and with the money of new investors. So this scheme really does require new investors, although current investors can always invest more money, and that happened in this case as well. Eventually, Ponzi schemes will collapse because it'll be impossible to obtain new investment. Madoff's Ponzi scheme collapsed when the stock market fell significantly. Madoff's Ponzi scheme was somewhat sophisticated, and he was pretty good at tricking people. We see that Madoff and his conspirators produced fake computer outputs and fake paper documents. Madoff really played on the laziness of investigators as well. He told U.S. regulators he was doing business with foreign banks, and he told foreign banks that he was doing business with U.S. banks, knowing that regulators on both sides would be too lazy to investigate that type of activity. Not everybody was fooled, though. A number of executives at other firms believed that Madoff was committing crimes. In 1999, a financial analyst had calculated that Madoff's operation must be criminal, as the returns that he was claiming were mathematically impossible if Madoff was investing where he said he was investing. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, did not listen to this analyst. Madoff was actually investigated several times by the SEC, and they failed to figure out what was going on every time. Madoff himself said that they should have caught him in 2003, but the investigators were incompetent. In 2008, Madoff told his sons, who worked for him as senior executives, that his investment fund was just one big lie and basically a giant Ponzi scheme. His sons immediately turned him in to the SEC. This was actually sooner than Madoff expected. He thought he had about another week to get some affairs in order, but they went right to the authorities. He was arrested on December 11, 2008 for securities fraud. In the end, the fraud involved about $65 billion, like I talked about before, but the actual net loss to investors ended up being somewhere between $10 and $20 billion. Still a staggering number. The range is so large because there are different methods used to calculate the loss. There are a lot of questions that had come up. For example, if someone invested $100,000 and was paid $100,000 in what they believe to be profits, are they considered even, or have they lost money because they should have been paid the profits and received their initial investment back? So really we see a lot of questions like this had to be answered, and again that explains why it's all the way from 10 to $20 billion. March 12, 2009, we see Madoff pleads guilty to 11 felonies, including perjury, securities fraud, and money laundering. Madoff was sentenced on June 29, 2009. Now, because of the enormity of the crimes and the fact that the judge believed that Madoff was not forthcoming with all information that he knew, like information about the conspirators, Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison. Madoff's projected release date is November 14, 2139. That's with good behavior. He would need to make it to 201 years old in order to see the light of day again. So statistically speaking, I would say that's fairly unlikely. Now, looking at his background, Madoff was born in 1938, married in 1959. He graduated in 1960 with a BA in political science. He had two sons, Mark and Andrew. Mark committed suicide in 2010, and Andrew died of mantle cell lymphoma in 2014. Both of them died after their father was sentenced. Madoff's father had experienced a number of business failures, which is surprising considering he really operated during a time when the economy was doing fairly well. His father filed for bankruptcy twice, and a tax lien was placed on the family home. So this could have led to like a fear of failure or a fear of not having money, but overall, we really see an unremarkable childhood that gave no indication as to why Madoff would become a con artist. Now moving to the mental health and personality factors, we see that Madoff really operated in plain view, staying visible but not too obvious. He knew that if all his investors got together and added up the amount of money they had given him, it would generate a lot of suspicion. He served several terms as the non-executive chairman of the Nasdaq market, and his firm had a pretty good record in terms of regulatory sanctions of any type, right? So he had a few blemishes there, but overall, his firm was pretty good in terms of the regulations. He did know how to keep up appearances. Some of his clients were high-profile, wealthy families from all over the world, high-profile charities, universities, and Wall Street executives, but other clients he had were retired, and they didn't have a lot of money. Some of his clients were friends and family. Many of his investors were devastated by the losses they took because of Madoff's crimes, and at least two ended their own lives. Sometimes Madoff's Ponzi scheme is portrayed as just a failure of the SEC to do their job. Like Madoff was just waiting around to get caught, stunned that no one could catch him. And of course, he indicated as much as I mentioned before. I think there definitely was incompetence in terms of the investigations, but Madoff was actively trying to get away with these crimes. For example, during one investigation, an auditor requested a trade ledger for a random date from the prior year. Some of Madoff's conspirators stalled the auditor as other conspirators printed out a fake ledger, put it in the refrigerator so it wouldn't be hot like it just came off of a printer, and threw it back and forth between them to make it look beat up, like a document that had been around for a while. The auditor was fooled by this fake ledger. With all this in mind, there's been a lot of discussion about psychopathy and narcissism in terms of what we see with Madoff. There is, of course, a bit of overlap between these two constructs. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics with which his behavior seems to align. Well, the first thing that strikes me is how calm Madoff was during his criminal career. He seemed to have low neuroticism. He knew he was guilty, he knew what he was doing, and yet faced numerous investigations and never seemed to lose his composure. Another characteristic that stands out is how manipulative Madoff was. He was confident, highly convincing. He would pay compliments to people. He not only manipulated investors, but he manipulated the investigators. And he was really quite proficient at doing both. Many con artists use high-pressure sales tactics. They'll say something like, let's make a deal right now before this opportunity is gone. You need to buy quickly. Madoff was a bit more subtle. He told people that he didn't need their money. He really only handled investments for friends and family members. He was really quite busy. If they had a lot of questions or concerns, they should find somebody else to invest with. And of course, with that tactic, people were handing their money over to Madoff. There's evidence that even in prison, he was still manipulative. We see a reporter had interviewed him a couple times and was emailing him back and forth, and he asked that reporter to get him a subscription to the New York Times. Now, she couldn't really do that because of ethical concerns, and she said as much. Then he said that he talked to the library, and maybe that she could send it to the library, but that was too complex. So eventually he said, I'll just give you the name of a friend. Like she was going to order the subscription in that friend's name. So again, even here we see he's trying to get his way regardless of what the rules are. We also see a lack of affective empathy, but he did seem to have cognitive empathy. So looking at affective, this seems clear because he was stealing billions of dollars from people. It's hard to imagine he felt the pain that they felt because, again, he kept perpetrating the crime. But in terms of cognitive empathy, this is actually pretty interesting because he did seem able to understand how other people were feeling based on how they were appearing. He could read people fairly well. One of the most clever aspects of his scheme was that even though the returns he was offering were high, they were not high enough so that somebody would look at it and say, this is too good to be true. He knew that people might look at him and think he was a con artist, so he compensated for that. Those low returns also had a second benefit. They allowed him to run the scheme for much longer. We also see evidence here for superficial charm. Madoff doesn't seem to have a lot of depth. Everything kind of runs on the surface. In the short run, this can make somebody very convincing. But interestingly, he was also convincing in the long run to many people. So sometimes superficial charm is all that somebody needs. We see a good deal of pathological lying here as well. He told lies to all types of people, including family members, for years. It's hard to imagine how many times he was on the phone with somebody or in person with them and he was lying to them. Even if he really did start his criminal enterprise in 1991, that's 18 years of lying to people every single day. We see a failure to take responsibility with Madoff. In prison, Madoff said that people still wanted to invest money with him and that he could make the Ponzi scheme work indefinitely. He was really just tired of all the anxiety. That's why he got caught. So the Ponzi scheme really didn't fail. He just quit. He just gave up. So again, even at this point, when he's in prison, he will not take ownership of what he did. Why did Madoff start this in the first place? Why did he start this Ponzi scheme and continue it for so many years? Well, it's really hard to know. He says that it started as a temporary solution to cope with stress, and then things got out of control. So really he's using the old slippery slope argument. He started with a small crime, and that led him to more serious crimes. I think another explanation is, like so many con artists, he enjoyed doing it. He enjoyed cheating people out of money. It would explain why he didn't set up an offshore bank account and move to a country that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. A number of people have said there must have been a point in time when he had hundreds of millions of dollars available, if not over $1 billion. Why didn't he just leave? Well, again, maybe he just enjoyed doing what he was doing. He liked having people give him money and trust him and violating that trust. So other thoughts I have here on this case, I'm alarmed that it was so easy for Madoff to attract conspirators. A lot of other people went to prison in addition to Madoff. Some people were convicted and did not go to prison. But either way, a lot of people jumped right in with him to commit these serious criminal acts. Next point, many of those who became highly suspect of Madoff failed to do anything about it, right? So when people suspected him of wrongdoing, they didn't necessarily take action. This is actually fairly common with criminals who can keep up a good outward appearance, and Madoff was very good at this. Now moving to my last point, I talked about this earlier in the video. The name Madoff does seem a bit ironic, and it made me wonder if somebody would trust a valet named Bernie Carjack or a surgeon named Bernie Shaky Hands. I was thinking about it, and what I came up with is probably, because with a name like that, that's tied to an undesirable behavior, I think the person would be all the more concerned that people would suspect them. So perhaps paradoxically, Bernie Jaywalker would be likely to be careful when crossing the street because he may think he would have a tough time beating a ticket for that offense. And I was curious if any name was really more associated with criminal activity. And I really couldn't find a source about last names, but there have been some articles on the association between first names and criminal activity. If we look at the top 5 names ranked by the number of arrests, we see Jeremy, Johnny, Randy, Terry, and Bobby. All of them end in a Y. Now, of course, this association is probably due to the fact that these names are popular. Interestingly, unpopular first names are actually more strongly associated with criminality. Research indicates that for every 10% increase in a name's popularity, there is a 4% decrease in the number of juvenile delinquents with that same name. So if you ever run into an investment advisor named Alec Ernest Ivan Money Stealer, you may want to look into their credentials before investing. I know whenever I talk about high-profile cases like Bernie Madoff, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.